Okay, great. Hi, thank you both, Michael and Jan, for coming together for this conversation. And I'll just say a couple of words about how I got the idea to do this, and it's in the preparation for an advanced training that I'm scheduled to teach later on this year. And I remembered from my advanced training that Michael had given a lecture about the history of the advanced training, and I realized that there's a lot of Rolfers out there that and structural integrators that don't really know how we got to where we are now. And from the time that Ida Rolf developed the 10 series, and then in an attempt to take things further, developed a 5-series advanced series, and which we used for a while, and then moved beyond to a more non-formulaic way of working, and ultimately to what we're now calling client-centered approach. And and then I thought, well, I could do my version of that, but it would be so great to have both of you describe that history and your place in it as two of the original 5 instructors that Dr. Rolf chose to carry on the work, and who essentially developed the work past that initial articulation of the 5 series. So I'll just stop there for the moment and say thanks again in advance, but turn it over to you, and let's take it away.
I'd like to say thanks, Russell, for asking, and actually for giving us the opportunity to sort of consolidate some of this, and lay it out so that so people can see where we started and how we got here. There's a pretty well worn track, but I don't think we've had a chance to articulate it that clearly. So I'm looking forward to chatting about this.
Great.
And Michael and I talked previously. He's going to lead off, and then we'll bounce back and forth, and obviously interact with you depending on how you react to what we're saying.
Perfect. Sounds great.
Yeah, I think it's important to say also that although there is a timeline here, there is a historical narrative. The development of the ideas, the experiences that led to the insights that took us down this path aren't exactly in a clear historical trend. So there will be a little jumping around here as we go through the experiences. And I think it's important to say that this is not the development of the work that occurred in those 2 advanced classes that Jan and I taught in 1988 and 1989. That work didn't come like an idea out of our heads. That work grew out of experiences that both of us had, both as students of Ida, practitioners, and instructors, and how we were trying to get this work to fit us, to fit our clients, and to see how we could make it better. So it wasn't something we thought up. It grew out of our experience. And I think the best place to start really is Ida's advanced class, and to make it clear that Ida thought that the work was not finished with the 10-session series. She wanted to go further. So she developed what she called the advanced class. And in that class, she was attempting to take the work further. And it's very important to state here that Ida made it clear that if you wanted to go further with the work, you couldn't just go back over the same ground that you had covered in the 10 series, that you had to take the work to a deeper level. And the advanced class was her attempt to take the work to a deeper level.
The way she articulated was that if you're going to go beyond the basic 10, you have to go to higher and higher levels of specificity with your clients in order to take them further.
So she invited people to come to the advanced class. Jen and I were in it. And in that class, she laid out the 5 advanced series, the 5 series. It was 4 advanced series. And in that class, Ida was when I first met her at Esalen, she was doing a demonstration of a first hour with the model on the floor, and she was on her knees. And I'm thinking, what in the world? Here's this elderly, very elegant, smart woman on her knees on the floor working on this person. And I tried to get myself to sit next to her at dinner, and I asked her, and she brought this up in class over and over again. She wanted to put the body on the floor to see where it was unable to adapt to an unforgiving surface. That would tell her where to work, because if the body was open, it should settle nice and gently onto the floor. And that idea was carried through in the positions that she introduced in the advanced class, the Z position particularly, which involved the model, the client, sitting on the table with one leg bent behind them and the other bent forward. And then the idea was you were going to find out, this was a very demanding position, and you were going to find out where the client could adapt. Same principle that she applied when she put someone on the floor and looked to see where they could adapt or not.
Was the thinking?
I had my first 8 sessions from Rolf, and they were all on the floor in the Esalen bathhouse with just like a 2-inch cotton pad mat, not foam, but a tough, almost like, like a futon sort of, but not fluffy, 2-inch.
But you see the logic of it, though. You see her reasoning here, how smart she was. She said, how do I know where I'm going to work? Let's put the body in a position and ask it to adapt. And let's see where it can't adapt. And we're going to go to work there. That principle still holds, by the way. It's a workable principle. It's just that, we'll go into this in detail, we found that Z position was very difficult. So Z position, the second session was a C position, where the client was in a fetal position on their side, knees drawn up to the chest. And the idea here was Ida was regressing the client to a developmental position that she thought was primary in the formation of spinal curves. We know that in the fetus, it's the thoracic curve that is the deepest and most primordial curve. Both the cervical and the lumbar lordosis form essentially after birth. And her idea was, let's go back and look at that primordial thoracic curve, and let's see if we can get it to lengthen out. We can look at where it doesn't adapt. Same principle, put it in there, have them tighten up, and see where those vertebra don't, and the paraspinal muscles don't let go and lengthen. Now, the other thing about her advanced class was this was the first time that Ida introduced arm work. In the original 10-session series, there was no work on the arms. As Jen said the other day when we were talking, that's because she didn't regard the shoulder girdle as weight bearing. So it really wasn't implicated in gravity, which of course we know now is actually not true.
That was her logic.
Go ahead.
No, that was her logic, that
Yeah.
you work the hell out of the legs because that's where the support in gravity would come from.
Right.
Your locomotion, the arms were sort of along for the ride. They were free to gesture while you were walking or standing, but they weren't weight bearing, and that's where her idea
Right.
was.
Right. And
Yeah.
of course, Hubert Goddard pointed out two centers of gravity, G and G prime. Now we know there are two centers of gravity, and anybody who's looked at someone who's got a flat butt and turned out legs and their shoulder girdle's way behind them understands that at that point the shoulder girdle has gravitational implications.
So that was
So,
a limitation then in her understanding as you see it.
yeah, I think it's very important, to make it clear that everything we've done is a consequence of the brilliance of Ida's insight into human structure. Um, she took it as far as she could go in her lifetime. And only by working within and on what she gave us were we able to have the experiences that led us to make the adaptations that we then went on to make. And she was very clear. She said, I'm going to give you a practice, a 10-session framework, go out, do it for 5 years, get really good at it, and it will teach you what you need to know. And in fact, that's exactly what happened. The experiences we got doing that work led us to where we needed to go. So it may look like we're, saying Ida was wrong here, and
Oh, no.
she
Yeah.
wasn't. She wasn't wrong. She laid the foundation. She
Yeah.
literally laid the foundation, and we just took what she gave us and developed it.
Can you say, do you know what, when she wanted to do when she said the work isn't done and she developed her advanced class, what she was trying, where was she trying to take it? And then as a second, and how did that relate to, were there other positions? I know the Z and the C position, you said there were four sessions, but somehow it became 5. And then, so I'd like to know a little bit more about that. And then I also want to know, as a secondarily, like, where you said that it didn't kind of come out of like your thinking, but it came out of your realization that you needed, that you guys wanted to take it in an additional direction. You wanted to add to that. What was it that you were noticing?
There's a story.
Yeah,
Here.
that brought you to those steps.
Yeah, there's a story here, but I'd like Jan to talk a little bit about Ida's 4 series, because all we have so far is the Z and the C.
Okay, well, so there were, in Ida's 4 series, essentially were organized around what she saw as the geometric sort of principles that she was trying to bring the body into. And the Z was to be able to take the legs not only out of gravity, but into a side sitting, as if you were on a couch and you tucked your legs one way or the other, and then to try to bring the spine into the middle. So it was a high demand on the hip joints and on the ability of the groin and glutes to kind of come along. And then the C, as Michael elaborated, was this recreation of what she called the embryonic C curve, which is how the fetus was in the womb, wound up this way with the knees high and the head tucked down. The third one was what she called the L, which was the principle of the right angle. This is where her arm work showed up, and she had a whole bunch of specific work with the arms that was organized around geometry. So it was the elbow coming straight out, initiating the movement of an arm, so you'd have pec and lat both fire. She did a lot of work with the arm in this position to keep the angle between the axilla and the elbow and the hand organized in relation to reaching, that would leave the scapula longer on the back as the arm came up before it recruited the scapula. So there's a whole bunch of differentiation, and there was corresponding work through the legs with the L position had a seated component. So once you had the upper girdle, then you'd have someone sit. and they would bend forward and back, and the knees were over the edge of the table. And so she was building the angles. And then the last one was the line. And that was where she tried to put the head on and then get the whole body to stack under a well-organized cranium. And in a sense, that was her closure. And I got kind of scared when I saw what was coming. You mean you're going to do a head session on me like a seventh hour, and then I'm going to get in my car and drive to Santa Fe?
That's the end.
There won't be anything else after that. And in those days, there wasn't any other Rolfer around where you could like get reorganized if you got undone. And so even in that advanced training, that first one, I had strong reservations about finishing a series with head work. And this was Rolf style. This was like seventh hour style head work. But it wasn't the whole session. The rest of it was stacking up, this beautiful vertical that she was trying to get in. You'd go from lying down head work, seated on the edge of the table, and then standing and walking around the room. And the idea was you would carry the line and the geometry with you. But here was a series of work that was predetermined before the client walked into the room. So in a sense, it didn't really matter who showed up. You were going to do this pattern and this sequence. And I would say some of us were already thinking, the advanced work is supposed to free you from the recipe and teach you how to make more coherent client-centered decisions about what you're going to do, assuming that the preparation work had been done with a basic 10, which was fairly formulistic and also very thorough. If you got down and did it, you got a lot of differentiation and a lot of lift in the body, and people learned how to manage their structures in a better gravity. But the advanced work had the same limitation that the basic 10 had, which was that she had created a formulistic approach.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think for me, some of that concern came later about a recipe-based approach. What was most apparent in that 4 series that Ida developed, the Z position, she was really going after because it put huge strain on the adductor group. And, we were on the ramus of the ilium there in that position and digging into the adductors, because really in the 4th hour side lying, you're not putting that much pull on the adductors. But the problem was very few people could get in that. In fact, almost nobody could get in that position and keep their spine organized. They were off to the side and they were trying to side bend to get their spine back in the middle, to get their shoulders back, and the lumbars weren't coming. Ida wanted to be able to get that pelvis in the Z position to settle on the table, both tuberosities equally on the table, because she would reverse the leg positions. And I think it was a widespread agreement that people weren't ready for this. It was too much of a demand on the spine. It couldn't adapt. Now,
could I interrupt for a moment?
Yeah.
Was that ever seen as a way to articulate the pattern? Because it seems like, if anything, it's also diagnostic, right? You see the relationship between the legs, the pelvis, and the spinal pattern going together when someone can't sit that way.
Absolutely. And it's true, as I said earlier, to Ida's theory, put it where it, make a demand on the structure and see where it can't adapt.
Right.
So she was being very consistent there. What's interesting, and this is where the story gets personal, Jan's back would go out in class and he'd end up on the floor. And, Ida's mantra was head up, waistline back. right? Because she was trying to get the spine to extend in both directions. Unfortunately, if someone has a spinal pattern where there's a diminished lumbar curve and the tendency for the lumbars to be too posterior to begin with, Ida's mantra, head up, waistline back, is actually counterproductive. And Jan paid the price because that's exactly what his pattern was. He had a flat lumbar spine. And we were talking yesterday, and Jan mentioned that after this had happened once in class, Judith Aston came up to him and said, you know, Jan, you have a diminished lumbar curves, so taking your waistline back is the wrong idea. Well, we know where that put us. That was like, oh my God, what's going on here?
Yeah.
So was that the spark of an idea that you?
This was the way the egg cracked.
Well, it was profound for me because as soon as I let my lumbars get a little more anterior, my chronic back pain dropped off by half or more because I had more spring. It was like the spring could actually bend instead of having these compressional hits every time I'd have a heel strike. My spine started to flex more. It should be said that I had a prior injury that set up some of this.
Yeah.
But I never had acute back spasms until I was Rolfed.
But what this did was it showed this was not an idea we had. This was an experience in the advanced class that said, for some people, certain given approaches, head up, waistline back, doesn't work. Maybe we need different approaches for different spinal configurations. That was the seminal idea that led to the theory of types and Jan's paper that essentially laid out that when you start to look at structure, you notice that people tend to fall into one of two basic patterns. And I'll let Jan elaborate on that, but that led to the idea that we can't treat everybody the same, which meant that the recipe had to be modified for some people as opposed to other people. And that you could see where that was going to go. That eventually led to non-formulistic Rolfing. That was the basic first step. And I'll let Jan talk about that.
Well, I'll keep it brief, but it does fit together here because, as Michael said, it was in that advanced training. This is what, 73 or 74?
Yeah.
That we began to have this conversation, which is, oh, there's a range of types of spines. You have spines that are kind of lordotic kyphotic, and you have spines that are relatively straight. You have people who have well-developed gluteals and a fairly curved sacrum. The glutes essentially are hamstrings, and you'd see that those people had access to that, whereas other people with the pelvis, further tilted back, flatter lumbars, flatter sacrum, had less spinal curves. And where does that fit? Because most of Rolf's directives were for kyphotic and lordotic spines. So we were left with this incomplete bit. And in the couple of years following the advanced training, I was looking at legs a lot. And at one point, I remember sitting with Peter Melchior and saying, do you do the same second hour for someone who's got bow legs or somebody whose legs are like an X? And he looked at me and scratched his head. We were having breakfast at his house in Boulder. And he said, damn, I just do the second hour and they all get straighter. And I said, okay, well, it wasn't long after that I realized that the X legs went with the straight spines and the O legs went with the lordotic spines. And this finally came through when John Upledger wrote his first book, Craniosacral Therapy 1, there's a line drawing of Upledger himself, because it's him, with here is cranial
Experience.
expansion, and the body has got his straightened back, his arms are rotated out, his legs are rotated out, and here's cranial retraction, and he shows the body folded inward. And I said, oh my God, those are the two types of spines. One's a straight spine and one's a kyphotic lordotic spine. And the X legs, all this came together in a thundering crash. And I said, there are two primary types of people. There's internals, who are cranial extension, and externals, who are cranial flexion. And expansion retraction is what Jean-Pierre went on to. He said, let's abandon flexion extension and go to expansion retraction, because it's easier to remember, and it's not flexion extension like a limb. But anyway, that's where that was the genesis of the internal external model. And this was the point where I want to say I don't mean it, but what emerged was that there were two basic recipes. One for internals. If someone was quite internal, then Ida's basic recipe worked pretty well. But if someone was external, there was all these variations that happened that helped them get on their line and allowed the flexibility of the spine to emerge. Two recipes.
So I want to
let me finish that, because there's a punchline. This conflict was the beginning of the split, because it challenged Ida's original 10 series as being incomplete, and that in order to be more coherent, and again, it was moving toward client-centered. It wasn't just, you could just do the series. You had to actually ask a question. Is this person more internal or external? Are they more of a straight spine or a hyper curved spine? Because that would take you into a more coherent 10 series just by making that observation. Yeah. So this was the seed that eventually led to the technical split around pure Rolfing as opposed to Rolfing post Rolf.
It strikes me that that maybe there was like, and I don't know, this is my word, but like an idealization of form that
well, I want to, before we go further, I want to say one thing. You have to remember, Ida didn't come fully blown out of the forehead of Zeus, right? She also stood on the shoulders of people who went before her. And there's a whole lineage of European women working with structure, and not to mention the influence of the osteopaths. But Ida was a late Victorian, emotionally and culturally, while intellectually she was a modern. She was part of that group at that transition in the early part of the century. Norbert Weiner, the development of, wrote his book, and Ida understood everything is connected. Norbert Weiner was the first person to say systems theory, everything interacts. That changed the way we view physiology. Everything is in a feedback loop, and informing everything else and adapting. Ida saw everything is connected. However, in terms of her understanding of posture, she was a Victorian, and uprightness was a sign of class distinction. It was a woman with a high big butt didn't work in high level social circles. Women, and it was primitive. Primitive people have high lordotic big butts, and that's why
ballet dancers are taught to tuck their pelvis.
Yeah,
it's exactly that
exactly. So I just want to.
So there was a form. There was sort of.
Well, I want to make it clear that Ida was operating within her cultural context,
right?
And to say it was an idealized structure. Don Johnson wrote a long paper early on about somatic Platonism, accusing Ida of idealizing structure. But I think, even though point taken, he misunderstood the complexity of how we view what is normal in the human structure. And it's very, very much, socially and culturally conditioned. So that's part of what we saw with Ida. And, part of why we were able to make the move is we were 50 years down the line into a much more different cultural milieu regarding the nature of the body. And that's why she ended up at Esalen, which was pretty, watching Ida with a flower in her hair, surrounded by
Hippies.
wild ass psilocybin taking naked people, you realize, did this woman come from another planet? Was she just dropped here? But she was absolutely at home as herself. And of course, all the beards of all the guys in Esalen got shaved off if you were going to come to her class and get a 7th hour. Because once again, you can't get your head up if your beard's touching your chest, you've got to, and I'd always had the hair on top of her head. And by the way, that hair went all the way to her butt. She had very long hair. So I just want to say that when we it looks like we're criticizing her view, we're not. We're simply falling into the experience that happened as a consequence of her view encountering the people who are studying with her.
Yeah, her context. It's like
Yeah, and
you're
out
trying
of
to
that
make clear
came-
her context and where she came from.
Yeah, and what's really beautiful here, and trust me, when Jan and I started to take apart the recipe, I several times thought I was going to be struck by lightning or something bad was going to happen. How could we possibly tinker with something so vital and so formative? But when Jan saw those drawings in Upledger's book, what happened was a naturally occurring phenomenon in the body, the excursion of the cranial sacral rhythm producing structural movement between what appears to be whole body external rotation and whole body internal rotation. That was a confirmatory experience. When you think of something and you think, this really looks to be true based on my experience, and then you look over there and somebody else has the same experience and is seeing the same thing, you go, wow, maybe this is true. Now, for me, it went even one step further because I've been a student of, Taoist martial arts for 30 years. And in the Taoist world, there are 2 spiraling motions in the body that exactly duplicate the internal and external rotation. So for me, now we've seen it in 3 different points of view. So you think something's going on here. This appears to be a natural phenomenon.
Well, there's and one more bit from this, which is that, even as Rolf claimed the body is a plastic medium, i.e. it can be formed and reformed. It gets deformed by adaptive shortening and patterning, and it can get reformed using the same mechanisms to establish higher levels of order. That was hers, and that's what she gave us. But what came later was that not only that, but when you touch the body, this rhythm is going on, this expansion retraction. It's like suddenly you realize the body's like a little rowboat and it's going up and down on the waves. And so you put your hands into what is a moving system,
Right.
not a static system. And that was the precursor to all kinds of changes in the actual technique of Rolfing.
Yeah,
And
and
I know
I
Michael's
want to
got
just finish up. We're going to go there in a moment, but I want to just finish up here with the development of the taxonomy in the advanced class that Jen and I taught. So the idea
Yeah,
being,
I was just going to ask you about that.
when you take apart the recipe, what are you left with, right? How can you possibly get oriented if you don't have Ida's recipe? Well, it's pretty clear that Ida viewed the body as a series of stacking blocks, but those blocks were not anatomical. So essentially what we did was, well, let's look at a deeper view of structure. And what do you have? You have, the two girdles, the shoulder girdle, the pelvic girdle. You have this central core, this visceral space, and then you have the axial complex, the spine. So that was the next step for us in developing a structural view that was independent of the recipe. You could now look at people and you could say, well, does that shoulder girdle match the pelvis? Which of these structural components is most out of coherence with the rest? And that could give you a clue where you wanted to start.
Yeah. I would just to elaborate, that this concept of core came out of Rolf struggling to describe what an organized structure looked like. And at one point she said it was like a generator has an armature and a field. So you spin the armature inside this fixed winding of wire and it generates electricity. And she said it's like an armature and a field like this. And then she said, or it's like a core and a sleeve. And I went, core, oh my God, and everybody who opens their mouths has a different core. I have a core idea, I have a core belief, I have a core, and I thought, God, that's not the right word. And so it came down to, let's call it the visceral space, because it's the inside in which the cavities in which the organs are packed, but it is a discrete space all the same. And therefore, the boundary of that space we could call the sleeve. And the sleeve is not an anatomical, but a functional idea. The ribs are sleeve to the thoracic visceral space. The belly wall is sleeve to the abdomen. The hips and ilia are sleeve to the visceral pelvis. So we have girdle, shoulder girdle, pelvic girdle, core, sleeve, and axial. So it's 5 points structural taxonomy, which became the root of body reading. You'd have someone walk around and say, which of those 5 elements is in the most trouble, which is least congruent with the mix of the whole? How has the person's adaptation either isolated or hyper included some element? Postural strains that are based in difficult psychology, where someone's shoulder girdle ends up wrapped around the base of their skull, or somebody walks funny, with their feet out like this. Well, that's a pelvic girdle with the legs, boom. And it affects the sleeve, it affects the visceral space, and you could see the cascade. But these elements are all embryologic layers. They aren't made up. They show up as the embryo develops. So this girdle, core, sleeve, axial is actually based in development and is a way to understand structure.
Yeah. I want to come back for a moment to this notion of core and Ida's, the metaphor that Jen pointed out of the generator with the armature and the wiring. Ida's, you have, it's talking about the body is complicated because it's very easy to mix metaphors, and all of a sudden you're slipping into something that is trying to describe an experience, and maybe you think it's actually anatomical.
Keep talking, I can hear.
Yeah, so I think that what Ida was about here was that she was trying to make a point that in a well-organized body, it's possible to be active in the world, in the girdles you're doing in the world, without disrupting the being that lives more at the center of the organism, that there's a possibility of preserving quietude or deep inner focus in the midst of worldly activity. And that, by the way, is a very deep spiritual concept. I mean, that's, if you look at tantric painting or listen to Buddhist lectures, that's part of the message, that the purpose of spiritual training is to develop an internal space that is impermeable to the disruptions of the world. And I think that, Ida was, it was very clear to me when I met Ida that this was an extremely unusual woman. And not only was she smart in developing a technology which actually could become a profession, she was carrying a message that went far deeper than just, we're going to put our hands on the body and we're going to make people more comfortable. She believed her notion of the center line was essentially an energetic metaphor. But she could reify it by pointing out that when you stack the body, you did get a actual functional gravitational line. It was anterior to the spine, but it was a functional line. But her point being was that people get dragged around. The character, the personality gets dragged around by the events of the world, and we lose some sense of internal coherence, some sense of internal peace. And for her, the core carried that metaphorical message that, if you can get the structure organized, the appendicular skeleton is not dragging on the essence of the person. They can preserve some internal space, so to speak.
I think goes to our concepts of differentiation and integration. I think.
Yeah, the integration.
If you're trying to differentiate in order to and establish something that, we're talking about interfaces, right? What Jan was talking about, the difference between core and sleeve, or these places where there's interface between deeper structures, and essentially the idea that the being lives more in the center and not.
This is, by the way, a very non-Western idea.
Yeah.
Because we believe in being. We believe in the solidity, the importance of objects that we can name and touch and measure. But to say that we live in the space between objects is what? Jeff wrote a really wonderful book called Spacious Body, where he tries to capture this notion. And that notion came directly out of Ida's teaching, that she wanted a body that was spacious, not compacted, not compressed. But, it's easy to miss the metaphorical implications when someone says, oh, we're going to create a spacious body. What do you mean? There's space in the body. There's quietude. There's emptiness. There's this experience of openness in the body. I thought the body was all about, moving stuff and being in the world. And so there's a silent message that comes through Rolfing for people. And Ida would talk about it, how people would get up off the table after getting work done. And she says, do you feel the quietude that's come into the room? Do you feel how the room got quiet? And I'm sure you felt this in every class. There are moments in somebody's session where the room just goes quiet, that the quietude in most people is missing. And this ability to open the organism, to get space in the organism, so everything's not dragging on everything else, to get, like you say, differentiation, creates the possibility of quietude and peace.
It's awesome. So take us back now, like in time, to where you were and how you made that transition.
Okay, so Jan pointed out that we now have a structural taxonomy, and we developed a 5-session approach to that structural taxonomy. And this one session that we put in, and this called cleaning the kitchen, meaning, and this was very interesting because this concept is a precursor to the idea, the principle of preparation. Because what you're saying is that if you've got a deep problem in there somewhere, you can't just go in and attack that problem. You've got to create some order around it so that when you release it, it has a space to move into. So the idea of cleaning a preparatory session became part of that advanced sequence. And as I said, this was essentially a premonition of that paper that Jan and Jeff wrote about the principles of intervention and the principle of preparation. If you've got a project, you prepare for it, open up the space, make it possible that you're going to get the outcome you want because you're making space for it to happen.
My buddy is a master mechanic. He's a guy who can fix anything, builds things of wood, metal. They got an old trailer, and he decided to renovate the old trailer. Well, an old type small house trailer. And I was over at his house, and he crawled under there, and he spent 45 minutes under the trailer just looking. He had a flashlight, and he came out, and he says, "Okay, I know how to get the trailer off the frame now." And then we're going to rebuild the frame, and then we'll put the body back on, screw it back together, and then put the plumbing in. And I watched him, and I thought, that's preparation.
Yeah.
That quiet 45 minutes on his back, crawling around, making notes. I mean, not writing anything down because he is a genius, but it's that same thing. That preparatory, that first session in an advanced, in post 10, you spend some time, you do a little work with the arms and the legs, and you stretch the back, and you feel the head, and by the time you got done, you should have the map at least loosely organized, like, how am I going to do this? An advanced body may need 3 leg sessions. Oh my God. Because you have to build the support in order to go anywhere else with the rest of the body. And you may have to do 3 arm sessions, God help you, because the person's been a machinist all their life, they've been using those arms in a very particular patterned way that has created immobility. In addition to high skill and high focus, they've lost range. So this thinking permeates the advanced side.
It seems like articulating these structural elements really gives you this opportunity to read the body differently. And I remember I think you were already there in 1998, and in my advanced training, that's how we approached it. We approached it in terms of which of these elements was most in need. And then, with the idea of support, there was always support in the mix as well. Like, if you do this, is there support for it? And I think that really kind of opens up the Rolfer's ability to respond to the client as they are, in some kind of a way that it strikes me as you're speaking that was maybe the crux of it that really freed it up.
It was. And I want to go back for a moment to a technical issue. Ida never taught arm work until the advanced class, that first advanced class. When she introduced her arm work, my jaw dropped, because Ida was insisting that the proper relationship of the humerus to the scapula was what appeared to be extreme internal rotation. Now, all anatomical books portray the arms ventral side up because that's a surface continuity. As soon as you start to put that arm in internal rotation, you've now brought a different surface in relationship to the thorax. But what she was saying And as far as I know, this may be unique to her. I've never heard this in osteopathic or physical therapy, certainly not in orthopedics. But what she was saying is that the most important issue here is the relationship between the humerus and the scapula. And, you know, everybody knows now humeroscapular rhythm because the extreme range of rotation in the shoulder girdle is only possible because it's such a shallow joint, which makes it unstable. So it's deepened by the peripheral structures that attach in the cartilage. But what she pointed out was everybody's in trouble because the scapula is too involved with the humerus, that the job of the Rolfer was to get separation between the humerus and the scapula so that that scapula could begin to drop in the humeroscapular rhythm as you raise your arm, because as you raise your arm, the angle of the joint has to change. And and that then led to elbow out, elbow in. But if you're going to throw a ball, you don't throw a ball like this. That's your, you know, if you're going to get speed and power, that elbow, that arm is in internal rotation. Same with a punch. It's in internal rotation. So Ida saw that the true functional relationship between humerus and scapula puts the humerus in a more internal position. And for me, that, you know,
And that
okay,
bears
you know,
on people's
now I
conceptualization
understood,
of
you know,
posture.
yeah, but
Posture.
all of a sudden the shoulder girdle made sense to me, you know, okay, my job, get those separated. If you do that, you're a long ways down the road to getting a better shoulder girdle.
And you're most of the way toward getting a better neck.
Yes, exactly.
Because so much of the girdle wraps the neck.
Yeah.
And everybody comes in, and I mean everybody comes in saying my neck is hell in one way or another. And I think we're probably the only school who actually would look at the hands and arms as a way to go into the neck.
Right.
If that girdle is wrapping up that neck, you can't do what you want to do with the neck unless you take the preparatory step of decompressing and organizing the shoulder girdle and the arms. And who else works on the arms to get the neck better?
Right.
It's Rolfers.
Right.
I love it.
So the next thing that happened in the development of the advanced class was a direct result of our contact with John Upledger. Jan organized a class in Albuquerque, right?
Santa Fe.
Santa Fe. Yeah, it was outside of Santa Fe. And John was just beginning to set up his institute. And, you know, he broke. When I studied with Ida, she gave me a copy of Sutherland's Cranial Bowl. I still have it, her copy. And she said, Michael, you need to know this. I'm not teaching it, but you need to know it. Well, we couldn't get access to the books because the osteopath said you had to be a DO or an MD to get them. Well, there was a lawsuit, and that ended. And Upledger then broke with the herd and said, this information needs to get out. I'm going to teach it outside osteopathy. And that changed everything. So Jan arranges the class. John comes himself with his wife and teaches this class. I'm in the class, 10 Rolfers, I guess, something like that.
All the faculty, Michael.
Right.
Except Emmett, who said, I'm not coming. I don't want to learn that stuff.
Right. Okay.
So Emmett boycotted. I mean, this is history, you know, but it's very important to understand where the split came from.
Yeah.
Because the rest of us spent 5 days with John Upledger, and he basically said, I want to change how you guys see the body.
Right.
Because I'm coming from fundamental osteopathy, you know, A.T. Still, Sutherland, right out to where he was. And it's vital that you guys know this stuff, because what you're doing is an element, you know, you're interacting with the system, but your technique is in this particular range of how you work.
So what happened as a consequence of this experience was we got introduced to the inherent motion in the organism, what Jen was talking about earlier, the boat floating on the sea, that, as a rolfer, an early stage rolfer, it's, a deep, solid, you have sensitivity of touch. You have to remember that all of these experiences that led to shifts in our understanding have now percolated down into the basic training. We teach a very different basic training because of these experiences that we've had. But the introduction to the idea that there is inherent motion in the organism independent of your input, and that number one, you need to pay attention to it. You need to be tuned to it. You can't ignore it, and you can't do violence to it. That was huge insight, so we got the idea of inherent motion, and we got introduced to the cranium as a structural element. We started to understand that the cranium was no different than any other structural element. Strain migrates wherever it's going to migrate, and the cranium is not immune from the migration of structural strain. It can go into the cranium and it can disrupt the cranial base, which has, consequences. And so this began a long journey into our understanding about the nature of our touch. And the outcome was what we started to teach in the advanced class as a spectrum of touch, meaning that when you work on your client, the touch that you apply when you induce movement or change reflects the nature of the tissue you're addressing, the level of the organism you're addressing. And even in the most resistant, tough tissue, there is a quality of motion that, if you can relate to it, if you can match it, will make the release happen much easier. And out of that also grew an exploration of what we came to call indirect technique.
Awesome.
And Jan has something to say about that.
Well, Upledger helped. He said, look, technique is basically has a range of gross to esoteric. And he said gross being dense, direct, firm, and esoteric being you begin to move to more congruent, like you take a tissue into the strain pattern to induce a release that would be normalization. He said esoteric can go all the way off body if you are capable of perceiving at that level. And of course, we then much later came to understand that there's an internal school of osteopathy, which was their biodynamic, which they held as essentially secret and sacred, and only a few people practiced it. Especially, well, the older generation learned it, but the newer osteopaths, many of them didn't. But for me, it helped frame for me my own touch. Oh, this is gross. I'm rolling up my sleeves. I got my elbow down on that, around the head of the trochanter, and I'm chiseling away at the gluteus minimus attachment. Or I've got my hand in the same place, but I'm following the inherent movement of the tissue and riding it in a sense and picking up on it, and then checking it and let the body struggle with my touch and then reorganize itself. And at a finer level, you sit and watch the hip.
Now, that's the easiest one to do, but it doesn't always produce the best result.
Well, I'm using it for humor too,
But this was revolutionary for us. Rolfing had this idea, this reputation is painful, and my friend called it intellectual mugging. But you go in and you rip stuff apart, and this changed everything, because now we understood that there was this quality of motion in the organism I actually felt it before I was in Upledger's class. I had started my practice in San Francisco, and I had a woman come in who had a really tough neck. And I had been grinding away, opening up the cervical structure. And then she built up this pad of tissue on the back of the occiput that was dense. And so I just started taking my fingers and working it, a little bit, just kind of twirling around and trying to get it to come up off the bony cranium, the membrane around the cranium. And all of a sudden that occiput dropped into my hands. I practically fell off my bench. I mean, I couldn't believe what just happened. But that was my first experience that the body is capable of moving on its own. It's not something we're making move. So spectrum of touch carried us, some of us then went and started to study with the tradition that came out of Jones in osteopathy, indirect technique, what's called position and release. And the story of Jones. He had this guy come in and had a really bad back, and he had to go, something came up with his wife and he had to go tend to it and couldn't start the session. So he said, can we find a way of making you comfortable on the table so you're not in pain? And they kept fidgeting with how he could. Finally, they found a weird way for him to lie in a series of twists on the table. Jones goes out, helps his wife with this crisis, comes back in, and the guy comes out and stands up, and the vertebra went back into place. That's the birth.
I don't know if I know who Jones is.
He was an osteopath who developed indirect technique.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So you go in the direction of the lesion, and this gave rise to our notion of pathologic neutral, meaning that the body is going to do everything it can to get into a neutral position. That's working for it, even though it may be far from what we consider to be neutral. But that's neutral for the organism. Now, if you want to go in and move a vertebra, for example, it's often best to get the vertebra in a position where it has maximum capacity of movement. And then introduce your vector of change from your hand. So that led to a little principle that came out of those two advanced classes in 88 and 89 called mobility precedes position. If you want to move something around, it's good to know that it's capable of moving. Now, then you get into strategies about, how to approach this. Indirect, more direct, whatever. But that was another very, very important insight that we had. And
just Jones wrote his seminal book was called Strain and Counterstrain.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's worth a read.
Yeah.
And
I'm familiar with those terms, but I didn't, and the concept, but I didn't know the name.
Yeah, strain, counterstrain.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so we have spectrum of touch now.
We've got elements, spectrum of touch,
taxonomies.
Right, and now the next big thing that happened here was Jen, we were teaching in Berkeley, and Jen was living in my house, and we'd be down in my office at night with 10 books open.
Georgette was in chiropractic school,
right?
And we had access to the library through her.
Right.
So
my wife, who was a Rolfer at the time, also Georgette Delvaux, had decided to go to chiropractic school. And what Jen and I would talk, and what we realized was there's a whole world out there of practitioners, manual medicine practitioners, who are talking about their work in an established language. We need to know that language if we're going to communicate with them, if we're going to be part of that club, if we're going to practice manual medicine, then we need to know the vernacular. We need to know the concepts that they're using. So at that point, we started to look at the established view for the nature of structural movement or biomechanics. And if we go back to Ida's mandate, that any advanced work has to take the body to a new level. You have to go to a place you haven't been before, and you have to work at something. You can't just give them 5-10 series. And in fact, there's danger in that, because the last thing you want to do is create discontinuity by having too much openness over here and not enough openness down there. And of course, Ida's metaphor of peeling the onion in the recipe, that the recipe proceeds surface to deep, she stopped at a certain point and she didn't go down into the ligamentous bed, down into the joint structures. And we realized we have to go there. That's where the strain is that we haven't yet approached. So that led us into a study of joint mechanics. And you go into the existing literature, and that information is all laid out. The orthopedic world understands everything about the nature of individual joints. They do not have a general theory of structure. They don't know how it all fits together. Ida was the first one to say, look, this is how it fits together. All this goes.
We had so much fun because, excuse me, Russell, were you going to speak?
Well, I was going to say that, and Kapanji was on the, I remember from when I trained in the 80s, Kapanji was on the reading list.
That's right.
That's as detailed as you're likely to find in terms.
I essentially memorized Kapanji.
We all did.
And then Gorman took Kapanji and got rid of 80% of all those arrows and made it a lot easier to understand. Kapanji got upset about that, by the way. And if you've seen the new edition, he's taken away a lot of those arrows and made it much easier to understand.
Oh, I didn't know that part.
He has
I haven't seen that.
He has a second edition.
One quick anecdote here, in the middle of that process, Michael and I, literally every night, we'd have the kitchen table was covered with anatomy books, technical books, that we were raiding the chiropractic library for. And one of the books was a manual of orthopedics by a guy named Stanley Hoppenfeld. And Stanley Hoppenfeld is very specific in saying that the sacroiliac joint does not articulate, meaning, that is a syndesmosis. It is essentially, it's grooved in there, even though there's a joint. It's not a movement joint. But you looked in the next, other views, and there's a synovial capsule in there. It's designed for movement. I'm sorry. But you could track that Hoppenfeld had a premise error, which was the sacrum doesn't articulate. And then everything he said about the lumbars that followed it was wrong because there was a premise error in the logical development of the ideas.
Yeah.
But what happened was it froze orthopedics into this, putting screws and plates and fusions and all of this layering of hardware to create an immobility that matched the immobility of the sacrum. And all of the manual medicine, I know that physical therapy struggled with this. I don't know how they reconciled this. Hoppenfeld was a spokesperson. This was a technical orthopedic textbook taught for years in several editions, and they never changed this sacrum mobility piece. But we stumbled on it, and we said, oh, we're Rolfers. We're going to align ourselves with the osteopathic view of this, that the sacrum not only articulates, but it responds to pressure changes of the circulation of cerebral spinal fluid at the other end because of the membranous connections all the way through. And so our technique is built on the concept that the sacrum articulates.
Gotcha.
And it puts us in a different, pardon me, it puts us in a different world than the orthopedics. And it's a little bit delicate, you know. We as people in manual medicine, we have to be careful challenging somebody else's sacred cow, you know,
And particularly if that guy's got a white coat.
especially if he's got a white coat and lawyers and but it's important to articulate it here, to say that we made a very clear decision that our building our biomechanical models and technical, you know, array that came is based on the mobility of the sacrum, and that deer sacrum is embryologically, it's part of the spine. It's five fused.
It's even more important.
Let me finish the thought, and then you can have it.
Sorry.
5 fused vertebrae. So the sacrum is spine. And then you have these ilia, and the ilia are functionally legs. So the ilia have a very well patterned response of movement on the sacrum, in the same way that the sacrum has movement on the ilium as it's doing its physiologic thing. And it makes the sacroiliac joint like, oh my God, this is the intersection point of the kinesiology of movement and the physiology of the circulation of the cerebrospinal fluid. And this is the root of most chronic back problems, is that these elements are not sorted out. And we have spent too many hours trying to come down to how we understand this. And this is what we teach today. We largely use indirect technique. We don't need to do adjustments. We have to know how the damn thing works, so you can put a fulcrum in the right place, and you'll get the correction. So, okay, I'm done.
Yeah, I mean, that's well said. And just to elaborate a little bit, you know, understanding the normal motion is a huge, significant part of the skill of any rolfer, because how do you know what's wrong if you don't know what's normal? How can you diagnose a misaligned sacroiliac joint if you don't know how it's supposed to move normally? And it's even more complicated by virtue of the fact that L4 and L5 have ligaments that go to the ilium. So iliolumbar ligaments at L4, L5 means that the lower back complex is a system of relational movement between L4, L5, the sacrum, and the two ilia. Now, why is it that so many back problems can be helped by organizing the legs? Because the problem often occurs, since most of the movement is in the legs, often occurs because the ilia are inhibited very often by the hamstrings. So they're not free to go through their rotational motion, which interferes with the sacrum and then interferes with the lumbars. Why is it that most orthopedic back surgeries are at L4? Duh. L3 and above are independent of the low back matrix. They're not part of the sacrospinal lumbar complex. And understanding this has been huge for helping us deal with chronic low back strain.
And for advancing the work, in a sense, talk about higher levels of specificity.
Yeah.
You know, that once we sort of pulled the iliosacral biomechanics out of the fog, it was so much fun.
It's totally cool. And I cannot tell you how wonderful it is. Someone comes in and they're all, you know, their gait's not right, and you go down there and you release the hamstrings and everything gets better, and they go, what did you do? What did you just do to me? And we know exactly why they got better. So
this level of specificity is really you know, like in the advanced training, that's where it kind of came. Sounds like that's the direction you took it.
Well,
Was it?
that was where when Ida said, if you're going to do advanced work, you have to go to a level that hasn't been touched before.
Right,
That was it. That's the level.
right,
And
Higher specificity.
as Jen said, if you look at, how complex is the relationship of the trapezius, the latissimus, and the erector spinae are quite complex, but the big muscles of the body, there's not a lot of complexity there. But you go down to the small muscles of the spine, or you start dealing with the bones of the foot, it gets complex real fast.
yeah,
But that's where we had to go in order to get the next level of order in the organism.
right. It seems to me like, I mean, I can only in some ways speak from my own experience, but like I felt like my advanced training gave me something to work on for solidly for about 10 or 11 years. You
Yeah,
know, and in some ways set the tone for what I'm still working on. I mean, and that, and I just want to remind you again that there was this statement back then when I took my advanced training that the goal of the advanced training was to bring the Rolfer to the place where the work was their teacher in a sense. And I think combined with this, the direction of the specificity and depth and understanding of motion that you're describing and the ways that that gets limited, that kind of gives you a bunch of stuff that you can basically spend the rest of your life working on to get better at.
that's right. I think I would say that the advanced class opens the door. It says, look at how big the world is here that you're entering, and how much opportunity you have to increase your skill and your knowledge in order to make people better. And the potency of Rolfing went way up when we started to look at these deeper structures. And a really diligent, rigorous, well-trained Rolfer, some of the best manual therapists on the planet.
I also remember quite distinctly thinking, because I did my advanced training about 8 years into being a Rolfer, and I had kind of wandered off into some, somatic psychology stuff, and I had trained with Peter Levine in his first SE training, and I was kind of in those what we would in Rolfing call those taxonomies. But I was in the structural, in the hands-on part of the work, I was really wondering, like, okay, is this all there is?
Yeah, I mean, I've heard Rolfers say that, well, I don't teach the hands-on stuff so much, because it's boring. We've already done that. And I go, what? You've got to be kidding. I mean, I'm 55 years into this practice, and I still haven't mastered everything I need to do in order to be truly effective for the people I work on. I mean, that's our commitment, right? We need to get as good as we can get so that we can be helpful.
Right.
That's our job. That's what we're doing here.
Yeah. And I mean, I had my, that was the place where I kind of said, all right, I can't have my foot on two different boats here. I gotta get in. I gotta get in one boat. And I mean, that really helped me to make that decision, because I saw how much more there was, and that was really the relationship that I wanted to have with people.
Yeah. And I think it's important to point out that, and every Rolfer would testify to this, that when we work on people, the effects of our work go into all kinds of corners in their internal experience.
Right.
The world, the inner world shifts. And we have ways of talking about that. We can use energetic metaphors or autonomic metaphor, understanding autonomic flows. And at some point, a Rolfer needs to be aware of the way in which those internal domains present themselves in a session, because if they light up when you're working, you have to pay attention to them. You need to work in a way that gets resolution at that level. And just want to tip my hat here. Jen mentioned it earlier, that the esoteric osteopathy, the work that in most recent years was carried on by Jim Jealous, who, by the way, recently died.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Oh,
And who carried that biodynamic mantle. But that is a way, that ability to connect with these deep internal fluidic, energetic flows in the organism, and understand how that contributes, how our position in relationship to it contributes to a self-organizing capacity in the organism, is a very crucial skill. And if someone comes in and they're lit up, or they've had some serious trouble, one of the ways I get oriented is I put my hand on their sacrum and I close my eyes and get real comfortable, and I start feeling my way into that energetic fluidic system, and it starts to tell me, number one, how's their state of resilience, and number two, what areas start to light up, so that I can get oriented that way. At the same time that I'm essentially telling their system, I'm here, I'm paying attention, I'm not going to disrupt you, I'm going to support you. And that creates the conditions in which it's optimal for the nervous system to be in when we work. And well, I mean, I'm saying what's obvious to most practitioners, but there are moments, there's something very wild going on with this work. I'll be working on someone and I'll have my hand into their hamstrings, behind the knee, in areas where I'm putting a fair amount of pressure, and they're like zoned out. Normally, you think this is supposed to be painful. Rolfing's supposed to be painful. They're falling asleep, or they're in some, hypnagogic state. And the more and more I realize that what we can do to get the organism in a receptive state increases the chances of a really good outcome. And sometimes I think what we call pacing, and we talk about this in the advanced class, you pace the organism, you match its rhythm, you enter into that rhythm, and it's like hypnosis almost. You sort of hypnotize the organism with your rhythm so that it starts to go, oh, it can't tell the difference between itself and you, which of course is the basic principle of hypnosis. And all of a sudden it goes, okay, I'm cool with this, and it lets go. And if you think about it, people come in, they say, why am I the way I am, Michael? All these things are going on. Why am I like this? And I go, no blame here, but, aside from all the accidents and abuse that you've been tortured with, this is the way you hold yourself in the world. And I'm going to suggest it's possible to let go of that. And of course, once you start talking about how you hold yourself in the world and start dismantling that, you're reaching into the deep levels of that person's internal experience.
Thank you for that.
So fundamentally, Rolfing is an inquiry into the nature of structure. And out of this inquiry, we come to this point where you realize that part of the nature of structure is that it's not structural. That its whole nature has these what we could only call energetic expressions, because they're not material. But there's Einstein's basic premise is you've got space-time and gravity. And gravity, space-time grabs matter and tells it what to do. And mass and matter bend space-time. So this is the nature of the body. We're always struggling with where are we in space and time, and how the hell does gravity go through me? But there's another part of the body which isn't about mass at all. I can have an idea, and I can have the idea that's not tied to my body. I can, we do certain kinds of healing in absentia. I don't say we as Rolfers, but it's pretty well established that certain kinds of healers can work outside of space-time. And, I can treat somebody who lives in Seattle. Is that Georgette there? Hi. Hey there.
Wife and colleague, Dr. Delvo.
Uh-huh. So part of the nature of structure is that it's not structural, but that by organizing structure, we create an effect that runs into the non-structural levels. The nature of being then moves in a different direction. It's more coherent, we'd like to think. And Ida, I think this is what Don Johnson accused Ida of, was she said, I'm trying to build a better human. And it was like, eek, you can't say that.
That is total hubris.
But
how could you possibly know what's better?
Yeah.
Happier, more efficient at work,
more peaceful,
better at sports. There's plenty of ways that you can determine what's better.
Make the body a more comfortable place to live. That's got to be better, I mean,
consumes less energy to move around. Mm-hmm. Calories, literally. Mm-hmm. Anyway, the inquiry is the important part. What is Rolfing? It's a system of manipulation and education to try to create a better functioning body.
Yeah.
Better functioning person.
So,
yeah.
Is there, I don't want to keep you guys for too long here. I'm wondering, pardon?
No, go ahead.
I'm wondering, is there, in this, I think you guys have covered a lot here, and a lot that I didn't plan for you to say you've said, which is really amazing, and I think will be very welcomed and well received by people. I'm wondering if there's anything in this evolution of advanced training, that we haven't covered that you want to make sure to include, in terms of where we came from and where we are now, just as a way of kind of wrapping up here.
I think this most recent conversation here pretty much wraps it up. We're at the end of my, when Jan and I talked yesterday, I made notes and tried to get some sense of narrative here. And we're at the end of the story.
Yeah, we're here.
Nice.
The end.
All right. Awesome. Thank you.